They placed me behind one of the thick cement pillars at my own sister's wedding like I was a stain on the family name. Bianca said I would ruin her aesthetic if I sat anywhere in the main camera frame. No one talked to me. No one even acknowledged I was family. The servers skipped over my table as if I were invisible. My parents smiled and raised glasses alongside their friends who assumed I was a caterer or some assistant. Bianca looked like royalty at the head table. A smug smile stretched across her face as if my exile was her crowning achievement. I stayed still, gripping my clutch like a lifeline, my eyes fixed on a faded coffee stain on the corner of my tablecloth. I was seconds from leaving when a man in a midnight, black tuxedo that probably cost more than my entire monthly rent settled into the seat next to mine. His scent hit first, a soft mix of spice and something rich, like old money and authority. He leaned close, his lips nearly brushing my ear, and said in a low voice filled with amused certainty, "Just go along with it, pretend you are here with me." I barely had time to react before he stood up again. When he walked toward the mic, the energy in the entire hall changed. Music halted, heads turned. My sister's joy twisted into confusion. My mother dropped her champagne glass. They had no idea who this man really was or what he meant to me. But more importantly, they had no clue what I was about to do. My name is Zara. I was 28 years old and had grown up learning how to make myself disappear. That was survival in a household like mine. My life had been a long lesson in learning how not to be a burden. On this day, Bianca was marrying Preston, whose family name came with country club invitations and generational wealth, the kind of marriage that would make our mother feel like she had finally arrived. The wedding was at a lavish estate just outside of Atlanta. Renting the venue alone probably cost more than my college education. I drove my little silver Honda Civic up to the valet stand. As I waited for the young man to take my keys, I could feel that old tightness build in my chest. I stepped out carefully and adjusted the hem of my lavender silk dress. I chose that color because it was soft and quiet and not something Bianca could accuse me of wearing to compete with her. I looked in the mirror one last time before stepping into the event. My skin was glowing, my bun was sleek. For a second, I let myself feel beautiful. That moment disappeared as fast as it came the second I stepped onto the marble stairs. Tiffany, Bianca's childhood friend and maid of honor, was in charge of the guest list. She had the expression of a nightclub bouncer. As soon as she saw me, her lip curled slightly. Her voice was sticky sweet, but carried the sharp edge of someone who never let go of old rivalries. "Zara Robinson?" she asked like she did not already know. I smiled tightly. "Yes, you know that." She pretended to scan the list slowly. There was a pause too long to be real. Then she tapped a name. "Right, well, there is a tiny issue with your placement." Bianca had to make some last-minute changes for the videographer. Something about keeping a unified look for the drone footage. My stomach dropped. "What does that mean, Tiffany?" She dropped the sweetness. "Look, your dress doesn't fit the main color scheme, and you have that serious energy that throws off the photos. You know how you get sometimes, so we moved you. It is quieter back there. You like quiet, right?" She gestured toward a set of double doors, way off to the side, far from where guests were laughing and sipping champagne. "Table 29 down that hall, through the service corridor. You are welcome." She turned away before I could respond. I looked around as strangers were ushered in through the grand entrance with warmth and drinks. People I had never even seen at a family barbie. You were being treated like royalty. But I was being funneled into the servants' passage. I clutched my bag tighter. I could have left, could have disappeared. Gone home, poured wine, and finished my latest draft, but I had made a promise to myself today. I would not disappear, not this time, so I stepped through the service doors. The hallway was narrow and smelled like cleaning spray and boiled chicken. I moved out of the way as caterers rushed by with trays and barked orders. I finally emerged into the ballroom from the back. It was breathtaking. Glass chandeliers shimmered overhead and soft music played under a canopy of white orchids. But none of that was for me. I scanned the tables. The front was glowing. Table 1, 2, 3 all surrounded the head table like planets around a sun. I kept walking. Table 15, table 20, at last table 29. It was shoved into a dark corner behind a massive pillar wrapped with tulle like a bandage hiding something ugly. One side of the table faced the swinging kitchen doors where steam and noise spilled out. The other side faced the men's restroom. My table had no flowers, just a crooked candle and a wrinkled cloth. The only other guests were Mrs. Hadty, a distant aunt with fading memory, who probably thought it was 1983, and a woman my mother once accused of stealing a spoon that turned up behind the stove. It felt like exile. I pulled out my chair, the metal scraping loudly against the floor. The pillar blocked my view of everything: the dance floor, the altar, even the head table. If I leaned just right, I could see the edge of the cake. That was all. I checked my phone. A text flashed across the screen from my publisher. Funds cleared, 2.5 million deposited. Congrats, ZJ King. I blinked. It still didn't feel real. 2.5 million for one book. On top of the royalties from my last 3. I could buy this entire venue, but no one here knew. To them, I was Zara, the flaky writer who never showed up to family dinners. They thought I lived off dreams and bad decisions. A shadow fell over me. I didn't even need to look up to know who it was. The scent of hairspray and gardenia gave her away. My mother, Mama Joyce. She wasn't smiling. She leaned down close, her sequins scratching my skin. "Why are you late?" she hissed, not even hiding the contempt in her tone. "Did you do this on purpose, make a scene, Rue? In your sister's day, just like always." I swallowed. "I got here early. Tiffany sent me through the service doors." She rolled her eyes. "Of course you blame someone else. Always playing victim." She looked me up and down like I had shown up in a trash bag. Then she grabbed my clutch off the table and started rummaging through it. "Hey, what are you doing?" I tried to grab it back. "Looking for your gift. I don't see anything on the table with your name. Don't tell me you came empty-handed again." I snatched my purse back. My heart pounded. "I sent $10,000 to your account last week. For the dress. You said that was my contribution." She laughed, harsh and cold. "That was reimbursement, Zara." "Reimbursement for what?" "For 9 months of carrying you," she snapped. "For the pain, the years, the food, the roof over your head. You owe this family more than 10,000. That was the bare minimum. The least you can do now is sit quietly and not ruin the photos. Your skin is too dark for the lighting anyway." She smoothed her dress and walked off, her words echoing like a slap. I was still reeling when Bianca showed up. She looked like a walking bridal catalog in Vera Wang and diamonds, but her eyes were sharp and angry. She leaned in. "What are those on your ears?" I blinked. "My earrings, small pearls, simple. They match the dress code." She sneered. "Take them off. They catch the light. I'm the only one allowed to sparkle today." "Are you trying to upstage me?" I gestured around. "Bianca, I'm sitting behind a pillar. No one can even see me. I can see them, and they're annoying me. Take them off or I'll have you removed. Mom said you'd try to steal attention." Mama Joyce appeared behind her like a shadow. "Take them off, Zara," she said firmly. "It's not your day. It's not your moment. Don't ruin the pictures." I took the earrings off, my fingers trembling, dropped them into my purse. Bianca sniffed. "Better. Just stay out of the way, and maybe go to the bathroom when the photographer does table shots. We don't need table 29 in the album." They left without another glance. I sat there. My ears felt bare, my chest tight. The ceremony music started soon after, canon in D. The guests turned toward the aisle. I stayed still behind the pillar. I couldn't see the bride's entrance. I couldn't see anything. I could only hear the crowd gasp and murmur. That's how I attended my sister's wedding, by sound. The officiant's voice floated through the speaker's beloved family and friends. I was neither beloved nor welcomed. I was tolerated, barely, and I hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The vows had been said, the cheers echoed, and now the music shifted into something lighter as guests flooded toward the bar and cocktail tables, their laughter and excitement bouncing off the crystal walls, but I stayed in my corner, still hidden behind the towering pillar, cut off from everything that made this day special, pretending not to care as joy bloomed just feet away from me, when in truth I could feel it like a weight pressing down on my chest. I adjusted the skirt of my lavender dress, brushing at the growing wrinkle forming across my lap, and stared down into my untouched water glass, trying to ground myself in something real as the sting of invisibility clawed at me. The shadows around my table darkened as more bodies shifted and moved nearby. And then I noticed a small procession drifting toward the service corridor. It was the groom's family, unmistakable even from a distance. They moved like people who had never heard the word no, slow, deliberate, and sure like they had paid for the ground beneath their shoes. Leading the group was Preston's mother, a tall, sharp-looking woman with silver blonde hair wound into a tight chignon. She looked like she belonged on the cover of a socialite magazine, stiff pearls around her neck, skin pale as bone. Her gaze swept across the room, not with joy, but with scrutiny, like she was here to appraise a collection, not attend a wedding. She examined the floral centerpieces, she eyed the waiters, she made note of the wine bottles, and then her eyes landed on me. She stopped, her lips curled in confusion, as if someone had spilled ketchup on the carpet. Her perfectly sculpted brow lifted slightly, and she leaned toward Mama Joyce, who had reappeared at her side like a desperate assistant trying to please her employer. She asked something in a voice just loud enough to carry over the music. "I thought you said the service staff were in uniform. Who is that girl sitting back here by the kitchen? Is she part of the catering team? She looks so glum, doesn't she?" I felt the heat rise in my neck. I looked to Mama Joyce, expecting her to correct her, expecting her to smile proudly and say, "That's my daughter, she is brilliant, she is a writer." But instead Mama Joyce chuckled, that fake nervous laugh she used when trying to climb the social ladder, and waved her manicured hand through the air. "Oh, her no, not staff, we'd never hire someone like that. She is just a cousin, a distant one from my husband's side, the kind you have to invite. You know how it is." Mrs. Preston nodded slowly, her lips barely parting in disapproval. "She is staying for dinner." Then, "Unfortunately, yes," Mama Joyce said, lowering her voice, but not low enough. "She has always needed a bit of help, you understand." She tapped her temple, lightly pretending it was a secret, but ensuring I heard every syllable. "Some mental difficulties. We let her come for the food. Really, it's the Christian thing to do, charity." And all I felt the words slice into me. I stared at my empty plate, too stunned to move. She had called me slow. She had labeled me a charity case, a mentally deficient poor relative that they allowed into their perfect world out of pity. Mrs. Preston replied with a tone so cold it froze the air, "How noble of you. The diluted bloodlines always need special handling. I suppose that..." They turned their backs to me and walked away, continuing their evaluation of the venue. As if I were not even present, I sat frozen, my throat tightening, as I tried not to cry right there in the shadows of the room. I could not believe what I had just heard, or maybe I could, and that was the part that really broke me. I was still staring at the tabletop when I smelled cigars and scotch, and looked up to see Daddy Ray, my father, in all his rented tuxedo glory, weaving toward my table, his smile wide, his steps wobbly, his cologne thick. He leaned over my chair, his voice a wet slur. "Hey, baby girl, you got any cash?" I blinked. "Cash, yeah." He scratched his head. "I left my wallet in the car. I need to tip the bartender, the one by the VIP table, the big guy. I don't want to walk all the way back. Give me a 50. I stared at him, incredulous. "You're asking me for money right now?" He laughed. "Come on, it's just a 50. You just got paid, didn't you? You're always writing those little articles and blogs from home. It's not like you have bills. You're a freelancer, no rent, no office over head, just you and your laptop. Give it up. Don't be stingy. Preston's watching. I need to look generous. I need to keep up appearances." I bit the inside of my cheek, my jaw tight. "Dad, I only brought 60 in cash for valet and emergencies. And you want me to give up 50? He waved dismissively. "It's not your life savings you write for the internet, or something. It's not real work." He leaned closer. "You hoard your pennies like some dragon." I sighed, opened my clutch, and pulled out the crisp $50 bill, my last safety net for the evening. His fingers snatched it. Before I could even speak thanks, he muttered, patting my shoulder, "You should smile more, Zara. You look like someone died. This is a celebration. We finally made it, Preston. It's money. Bianca's locked in. We won, so act like you belong." He winked and strolled off like he'd just done me a favor. I sat there stunned, robbed by the man who used to braid my hair before school. When he still remembered I existed, I shook it off as best I could, and tried to calm the rage rising in my chest. The string quartet shifted gears, playing Canon in D again, the music swelling as guests turned toward the front for the ceremony. I could hear chairs creaking, shoes sliding across polished floors, and camera shutters clicking, but all I could see was the chipped wall next to the kitchen, and the flicker of candlelight on my sad little table. The words "beloved family" echoed over the speakers, and I almost laughed. I was not beloved. I was an extra body, placed here to fill space, to be kept out of sight. My phone buzzed. I glanced down the screen, lit up with a notification from my bank. The banner alert made my heart skip. It was a royalty deposit from my publisher, a full payment, $2,500,000 for the latest quarter, for the movie rights for the paperback surge. It was more money than anyone in this room probably had in their savings. I stared at the screen, letting the number sink in. $2,500,000. Just like that, the room's cruelty melted into something meaningless. The people who pitied me would never know the power sitting in my palm. They thought I was broke. They thought I was struggling. They thought I was the family disappointment. But the truth was, I could buy every person in this room and still have change. I locked the screen and tucked it away. Let them think what they wanted. I knew who I was. I was Z.J. King. I was a best-selling author. I was a ghost with millions in the bank, and I was not going to run anymore. A waiter suddenly rushed through the side corridor, juggling a tray of red wine. He was moving too fast, rounding the pillar, and did not see me. His hip slammed into my chair, and before I could react, the tray tipped, and crimson liquid spilled across my lap, soaking the lavender silk. Instantly, a glass shattered on the floor. I jumped up, gasping, the cold wine bleeding across my thighs. I looked at the waiter, expecting an apology, a towel, anything. He just rolled his eyes and snapped, "Maybe don't sit so far out. These tables are for service, not lounging. You people always in the way. Country manners." I watched him step over the glass and disappear into the kitchen. Rage surged through me again. The guests nearby turned to stare, some curious, some amused. One even laughed. And that was when I hit my limit. I grabbed my clutch, shoved my phone and purse together, and stood to leave. I was done with this room, done with these people, done pretending I belonged in the shadows. I turned to go, and that was when I saw the hand. It was large, steady, held out to me, palm up, like an invitation wrapped in silk. A pristine white handkerchief rested in the fingers. I looked up, following the hand to the wrist. A Rolex gleamed, the suit tailored perfectly, his frame broad, powerful, his face striking and calm. He smiled gently, his voice a rich, low tone. "Take it, dab, don't rub silk stains." Easily I stared, frozen, as he pulled out the chair beside mine and sat like he had always belonged there. He looked around our sad table, lifted the name card in front of him, and smiled. "Mildred, I don't think that's me, but I guess it's open." I blinked. You can't sit here. That seat was meant for my great aunt. She passed 4 years ago, but the list was never updated." He chuckled, tossing the card aside. "Fitting. Then this whole wedding feels like people pretending not to notice the cracks. Have you tasted the champagne?" I shook my head. He gestured toward the center of the room. "It's sparkling cider with white wine. I can smell the preservatives. The orchids are fake, too decent quality, but rented none the less. This whole thing is a rented dream, shiny, hollow." I raised an eyebrow and answered dryly, "The lighting is pink to cover water stains on the ceiling, and if you look at Preston's tuxedo, you'll see a store security tag tucked under the sleeve. They plan to return it tomorrow. This is not a wedding, it's a performance with a cash bar." His smile deepened, eyes lighting up with surprise. "You're sharp, more than the family narrative suggests. I heard your mother call you slow earlier. That was a lie, wasn't it? Just like the champagne." I nodded, my jaw tight. She wouldn't know truth if it slapped her. "I prefer to observe. I see what others miss." He leaned back, his movements slow, elegant. "I'm Dante," he said, "and I have a feeling you and I are going to get along just fine." He studied me carefully, then asked, "What do you do when you're not hiding behind pillars?" "My family says I'm a broke freelancer or a ghost, depending on the mood. They think I write blogs for pennies." Dante frowned. "I didn't ask what they think. I asked what you do." I hesitated, then said quietly, "I write stories people don't want to hear about. Pain in pretty houses, secrets swept under rugs." His face changed, like he'd been hit with realization. Slowly he leaned in. "I own Sterling Media. Last year we acquired a publishing house. I've been chasing an author, a ghost named Z.J. King, wrote a memoir, Shadows in the Garden." He paused, then locked eyes with me. No one knows who she is, but your voice, the way you speak, the sharp metaphors, the timing, it sounds exactly like her. I froze, keeping my expression neutral. I've heard of her, I said. Dante smiled. You don't have to confirm it, not yet, but I have a good ear, and I'm sure I just found my ghost sitting in the shadows of a wedding she paid for. I swallowed hard. He leaned closer. You're not invisible to me, Zara, and I suspect you're about to become the most visible person in this room. He was right, and the moment was coming faster than I thought. As the room swirled in a blur of champagne and false smiles, Bianca held court at the head table like a queen surveying her kingdom, her veil glowing under the chandeliers, while laughter erupted from guests who worshipped her every word. But she kept scanning the crowd, her eyes restless, like something was off. Her gaze swept across the room, hunting for someone important. Her fingers drummed against the glass stem of her flute, tapping in sync with her growing unease. And then her eyes landed on the last place. She expected to look toward the shadows behind the pillar where she had sentenced me to vanish. Her eyes locked onto the man beside me, and her whole posture changed. The smile on her face slipped, her body froze. The hand holding the champagne flute dropped to her lap, and her pupils widened with disbelief. She saw him sitting at table 29, wearing that perfect tuxedo, with a presence too large for the shadows, and she saw me beside him, our hands close, his attention fixed solely on me, as if the rest of the wedding had disappeared around us. The confusion on her face shifted slowly into something darker, fury. She looked down at her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, ignoring the rules of etiquette, forgetting she was the bride in that moment. She was no longer performing, she was reacting. Her message buzzed, my phone on the table, vibrating hard enough to rattle the silver. Where I glanced down, the screen lit with her name, and a message that read, "Get away from him right now. Do not think I do not see what you are doing. He is Preston's guest, not yours. Stop trying to embarrass me. Do not make me come over there and throw you out. You look pathetic trying to trap a man like that." I read the words slowly, feeling each one press against my ribs like knives. She will unraveling, her desperation laced in every sentence, and for once I did not feel hurt. I felt satisfied. I turned the screen face down and looked back at Dante, who was calmly sipping his water, as if he had not just set the entire wedding on fire with his presence. He glanced at me and smiled, soft and amused. "They are looking over here," he said softly. "Should we give them something to stare at?" I smiled back, barely nodding. A moment later, the Prestons returned in a pack, Preston himself slightly off balance, his jacket open, his tie already askew, and his eyes glossy from too much whiskey. His mother followed behind, her mouth tight like she had tasted something sour. They were heading directly for our table, and I could feel the tension gathering like storm clouds. Preston stopped short when he saw who Dante was seated with. He blinked twice, then forced a grin. "There you are, Mr. Sterling. We've been looking for you. My father is eager to talk business, and we've got Blue Label waiting for you at the main table. You do not want to waste time back here in the cheap seats, not when the action is up front." Dante did not stand. He did not release my hand. In fact, he rested it gently on the white tablecloth, letting everyone see our fingers intertwined. "Actually, Preston, I am quite comfortable right here," Dante said, his tone calm but firm. "I was just telling Zara how refreshing it is to find intelligent conversation at events like this. We are having a great time." Preston's grin faltered, his eyes darted to our hands, then back to Dante, and then to me. His jaw shifted as if trying to compute something that did not make sense. "But she is," he started, then caught himself. "She's just Zara. I mean, she is no offense. I'm sure she's great company, but we just thought you'd prefer better surroundings." Dante leaned back, smiling slightly. "She is more than great company, Preston. She is captivating. I would not trade this seat for any table in the room." Preston's mother let out a soft gasp, her face pinched in disapproval. She was trying to figure out how the woman she had dismissed as slow and poor was suddenly seated with a media mogul, whose name carried more weight than hers ever would. But she said nothing. They both stepped back, stumbling over awkward farewells and forced smiles as they retreated toward the head table, unsure of what reality they had just entered. I squeezed Dante's hand gratefully and stunned. He turned to me with a glint in his eyes. "Shall we make the most of this?" he asked. I nodded, unsure what that meant, until he stood smoothing the front of his jacket and extending his hand to me, not in a forced gesture, but an elegant invitation. It is time, he said, time to rewrite. Narrative. I hesitated for only a moment, then placed my hand in his. He tucked it into the crook of his arm, and we began walking out from behind the pillar, stepping into the light of the main ballroom. As if emerging from the shadows of another life, we did not take the side route or sneak along the wall. We walked directly down the center aisle toward the head table through the heart of the wedding. The effect was immediate. Conversations paused, forks hovered in midair, all eyes turned, whispers began like falling dominoes. Is that Dante Sterling? Who is that woman with him? Is that Zara, the sister? Heads swiveled, necks craned, we walked slowly, deliberately, as though we were not just walking but claiming space. I felt the warmth of Dante's arm and the weight of eyes on me. And for the first time in my life I did not shrink. I stood tall. The wine stain on my dress suddenly did not feel like a flaw. It felt like battle armor. The lavender silk that Bianca had mocked now glowed against Dante's tuxedo, looking regal and intentional. I heard a woman at a nearby table whisper, "I love that color on her, so vintage, so chic." I almost laughed. 20 minutes ago I was hidden, now I was a mystery worth watching. We reached the velvet rope guarding the VIP section. The security guard who had ignored me earlier straightened instantly as soon as he saw Dante. "Mr. Sterling," he said quickly, unhooking the rope. "Right this way, sir." Dante nodded, and we stepped through, entering the space that had been built for the elite, the chosen few. My mother was by the bar mid-laugh with Preston's father, until she saw us and her laughter died instantly. Her mouth hung open, her napkin frozen halfway to her lips. Bianca stood near. By her face pale, her eyes wide, she clutched her bouquet tighter like it might anchor her to something stable as she watched us approach. Dante gave them a polite nod. "Good evening," he said coolly. "Lovely event. We are just grabbing a drink." He steered us toward the bar. People moved aside for us like parting waves. He ordered us drinks while I stood in stunned silence. Then he passed me a glass and stepped away, giving me a moment alone. But Mama Joyce wasted no time. Her hand clamped onto my arm, dragging me behind a large floral display, her face twisted with panic and fury. "What are you doing?" she hissed. "What spell did you cast on him? Did you drug him? Did you lie? A man like Dante Sterling does not look at girls like you." She stared into my eyes, desperate and trembling. "This is real money. Zara Preston needs this investment. If you mess this up, if you scare him off, I will make sure you never see another dime from this family. Do you understand?" I pulled my arm away, rubbing the red mark left by her nails. "I am not doing anything except breathing," I said coldly. "I am simply existing, which you never seem to allow." She slapped her hand over her mouth, realizing she had raised her voice too much. Dante returned, placing himself between us effortlessly. His posture protective. "Is everything all right here, Mrs. Robinson?" he asked, his voice still polite, but laced with warning. "You look flustered, perhaps too much excitement." Mama Joyce straightened her spine, her voice cracking. No, just mother-daughter talk," she said, smiling tightly. "I was just surprised to see her here out of the corner. I mean, she's usually so shy." Dante raised his glass and looked down at me, then back at her. "Well, you better get used to seeing her in the center, because she is not hiding anymore. Not tonight, not ever again." Before she could respond, Bianca swept over her wedding gown. Swishing like a storm, she wedged herself between us, her smile tight and false. "Mr. Sterling, you naughty man," she said, "you stole my sister away. I hope she has not bored you too much. Zara can be so exhausting with her stories." Dante tilted his head calmly. "Actually, I find her fascinating. She is by far the most interesting person in this entire room." Bianca's smile cracked for a second, just a hairline fracture. Then she recovered. "You're too sweet. Come sit at the head table with me. We saved you a seat right next to me, and we have actual champagne, not this stuff." Dante took a step back, barely concealing his dislike. "I'm comfortable where I am, Bianca," he said politely. Then his tone sharpened. "Tell me something. Why did you seat your sister behind a concrete pillar?" Bianca blinked. Why was Zara at table 29 behind the kitchen? Was that a mistake, or did you not want her seen? Bianca stuttered, her smile fading. It was a spacing issue. We were full." Dante raised one brow. "You had seats for college roommates and third cousins, but not your sister. That's interesting. It says a lot." Bianca turned red. Just then, Preston arrived, reeking of liquor and bravado, and completely oblivious to the storm in progress. "Hey, Mr. Sterling," he boomed clapping Dante on the back, which was not appreciated. "We need to talk money. My dad is waiting over there. We need to know about that 5 million. The mills are ready." Dante did not even glance at him. He slowly peeled Preston's hand off his shoulder. "We're at your wedding, Preston, not a boardroom. Your wife was just explaining the logistics of hiding her sister behind a column." Preston laughed awkwardly. His gaze landed on me. "Oh, right, the dark horse," he said loudly, too loudly. "Careful, Dante. She's got sticky fingers. She'll rob you blind." Then he chuckled at his own joke. The room around us quieted slightly, and I saw eyes turning again, watching, mouths covering laughter. Dante's face went completely still, like the calm before a thunderclap. "Apologize," Dante said suddenly, his voice sharp and low. Preston blinked. "What, apologize to her now, or I will knock your teeth out in front of your guests?" Preston scoffed. "It's a joke. She knows it was a joke, right, Zara?" Dante stepped forward, grabbing the front of Preston's jacket, lifting him slightly off balance. The crowd gasped. A few security guards began to move, but I stepped in, laying a hand on Dante's arm. "Don't," I said softly. He looked at me, eyes wild. "He deserves it." I nodded. "Yes, he does, but not from you. You're better than this." He stared at me, breathing hard, then let Preston go, who stumbled back, clutching his jacket. "You're lucky she stopped me," Dante said, glaring at him. I looked at Preston, calm and steady. "I am not nice, Preston. I am patient. And you're about to find out just how much damage patience can do." He laughed nervously. "Damage from you? Sure, what are you going to do? Tell your little blog readers?" I smiled coldly. "Just wait, the check is coming." The room was thick with tension, still vibrating from Dante's restrained fury and my calm warning, like we had just cracked the polished floor of the Robinson performance stage with a single fault line. And it was only a matter of time before the whole facade gave way. Preston backed off, muttering something incoherent as he straightened his wrinkled tuxedo, his bravado draining from his face like wine spilling from a broken glass. And when he turned away, he did not look like a groom. He looked like a man who had just realized that the tables had turned, and the woman he tried to belittle was one who had the pen and the power. The violinist shifted to a new piece, the clinking of silver, where resumed cautiously, like the guests were unsure if it was safe to breathe again, and Dante gently tugged out my chair, guiding me to sit once more, and he followed calmly, the weight of the moment settling into a hush around our table. The spotlight was off us for now, but we both knew the next act was coming. I looked at him, and he looked at me, his eyes curious and steady, and then he murmured, "Eat your dinner, Zara. You are going to need your strength for what is coming." I did not ask what he meant. I already knew. As we sat there, the lights dimmed slightly, and a microphone screeched at the front of the room. My father, Daddy Ray, tapped the mic twice, sending feedback across the room before clearing his throat with theatrical flair. The attention in the room shifted to him, and suddenly he stood center stage, bathed in light, holding his champagne flute with all the pride of a man who thought he was giving a presidential address. He beamed at the audience and then turned to the head table. "My friends, my family, distinguished guests," he began, his voice booming through the speakers, "I stand before you today as a proud father, blessed by the grace of God to witness a miracle, and that miracle is named Bianca." The applause rose polite, rehearsed. Bianca gave a soft smile, dabbing her dry eyes with a napkin, as if she were on the verge of emotional collapse, while I sat there unmoving, my heart beating in steady, bitter pulses. "You know, folks, raising children is not easy." Daddy Ray continued, his voice dropping into that fake humble register, like he was sharing sacred wisdom. "It is a journey, a sacrifice, but every drop of sweat, every sleepless night is worth it when you are raising someone like Bianca. Our shining star, our one and only angel." My stomach twisted at the words, "our one and only angel." He had said it like there had only ever been one child worth mentioning, like I was never born, or had faded into the wall behind the kitchen. He kept going. "And she's not just beautiful, no, this one is brilliant too. My Bianca graduated top of her class from Harvard. Can you believe that, folks? A Robinson girl walking those hallowed halls." I watched the room erupt into applause again. A few guests even stood to clap. I looked down at the table, biting the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing, because the truth behind that Harvard story was as fake as the orchids on the centerpiece. Bianca had barely graduated high school, and I was the one who wrote her entire application essay, the one who researched and ghostwrote half her college papers, the one who stayed up nights finishing her thesis on economic reform while she got drunk with her friends on spring break. Her degree may have had her name on it, but it was built on my hands and they would never know. And then he said something else that cut deeper, and we all know it was not easy getting here. He said, shaking his head, we had challenges. We had burdens to carry, and we carried them because that is what family does. He looked directly toward the table where I sat, though he pretended not to see me. We carried the weight of a child who needed more than most, who cost more than most, who slowed the family down. But we carried her because that is what good people do. The words landed like bricks on my chest. The child who slowed the family down, that was how he saw me, that was how he described me to a room full of strangers and future business partners, as a burden, as something they had to tolerate. He raised his glass again to Bianca, the strong one, the one who made all the sacrifices worth it. Another round of applause, this time louder, fueled by alcohol and obliviousness. And as they clapped, Dante's hand found mine beneath the table, his fingers warm and grounding. He leaned close to my ear and said that was not a speech, that was confession. I turned my head to him, confused. What do you mean? The way he framed it. He said softly, the words he chose, the rhythm he used. That is the exact tone, the exact pattern from that manuscript. The one I told you about 3 weeks ago, the unpublished one, the one I want to turn into a movie. Shadows behind the pillar. I froze. The name alone made my lungs tighten. That was the manuscript I had written in the dark, in the early hours of lonely nights. It was the rawest thing I had ever created, a memoir masquerading as fiction, a brutal recollection of being raised by narcissists who only loved the mirror image of themselves. That manuscript was my story. It was everything I never had the courage to say aloud. How did you know? I whispered, my voice trembling. Dante looked at me, his expression soft. Because no one could fake that kind of pain. He said quietly, fiction has to make sense. Reality doesn't. The way he described you, the way your mother treats you, the way your sister banishes you from sight, it all matches the pages I read. And it is not just writing, Zara, it is war poetry. I looked at him, then really looked at him, and I knew the secret I had buried for years was now uncovered. Yes, I said, I am ZJ King. He nodded slowly, then smiled. The sequel is going to be a tragedy for them, he whispered. And it is going to be beautiful. The waiters began moving again, clearing plates, refilling wine, and preparing for the main course. I barely noticed the expensive cutlery, the dishes arriving with lobster tail and filet mignon. I barely felt the hunger. I had not eaten all day, and yet the only thing I could taste was bitterness, until the waiter approached our table with a tray full of steaming dishes, and placed one plate in front of Dante, and reached for the second when Mama Joyce appeared again, her gold sequin dress catching the light. As she stepped into our space with fake charm and dead eyes, she blocked the waiter's hand. That one does not go there, she said with a smile. We've had a bit of a mix-up. The kitchen ran out of entrees. The waiter hesitated, looking down at the tray. There were clearly more plates waiting, but she insisted, oh Zara dear, I am so sorry, we must have miscounted. The lobster is all gone, you understand. I stared at her. Her smile was too big, her voice too high. And then she added casually, looking at my waistline, it's probably for the best anyway. I mean, with how tight that dress is, you'll thank me later. Just have some bread, the rolls are warm. I blinked, stunned. She had just publicly denied me a plate of food, and disguised it as concern for my diet. She had just mocked my body and my presence again. But this time Dante did not let it slide. He reached for his plate, lifted it, and slammed it in front of me. The gesture loud and clear. Eat, he said firmly. I looked at him. But Dante, I started. No. He cut me off. That is yours. I am not hungry. And Mrs. Robinson, he turned to her slowly, if you are concerned about shortages, maybe you should worry about why the catering team is packing up early. They mentioned something about a declined payment, but surely that is just gossip. Mama Joyce paled, her mouth opening, but no words came. She stepped back, retreating quickly to investigate, and Dante simply poured me a glass of water and said calmly, eat, Zara. You are not invisible, not tonight. And I picked up my fork and took the first bite of warm buttery lobster. And for the first time all night I felt full, I felt real, and I felt dangerous. The main course had barely been cleared when Bianca returned, floating toward our table with a glass of red wine in her hand and fire in her eyes. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile wolves wear before they bite. Oh look, she said, cloying and loud, my big sister finally gets to eat. I was worried they had forgotten about you. I mean, you do blend into the background so easily. She leaned on Dante's chair, tipping the glass slightly sloshing the dark wine close to the rim. Zara, you looked so faint earlier. Maybe it was all the emotions or the shadows. She took a step closer, her hip brushing the table. Then it happened. She moved just enough. Her wrist flicked, the glass tilted, and the wine poured out thick and deep. Red splashing across my chest, staining the lavender silk, a violent burgundy the cold soaked through instantly. I gasped, the liquid sliding down the front of my dress. Bianca gasped too. "Oh no," she said in a syrupy voice. "I am so clumsy." She reached out with a napkin, dabbing at the fabric, her touch pressing the stain deeper into the threads. Then she smiled again, that slow, cruel smile, and said, "Actually, this is an improvement. The color suits your skin better, hides the dirt more easily." She turned to Preston, who had wandered over, and he laughed loudly. "She got you good, Z. That dress was a disaster. Anyway, now it's modern art." The tables nearby giggled, laughter buzzing around us, as if I had become the punchline of the bride's final joke. I sat there, dripping the wine, cold and sticky, clinging to my body, but I did not cry, I did not flinch. I looked at the stain and realized this was not an accident. It was a declaration of war, and she had no idea that I had already won. I slowly reached for my napkin, wiped a drop from my wrist, and placed it on the table folded neatly. I turned to Dante, who was staring at Bianca like he was debating whether to speak or let me speak first. I gave him the smallest nod and then looked at Bianca with the kind of smile that had no warmth, just teeth. "This is the part I love," I thought, "the moment when the villain thinks they are in control, right before the sky falls on them." I leaned back, calmly straightened my shoulders, and waited because the finale was only beginning. The room buzzed with laughter again, as if nothing cruel had just happened, as if the bride had not deliberately poured wine onto her own sister and mocked her in front of hundreds of guests. And that was when I truly understood how deeply normalized my humiliation had become. It was entertainment, them a sideshow, a momentary distraction before dessert. I sat there with the fabric of my dress clinging to my skin, the wine stain spreading darker as the minutes passed, but inside me something had shifted permanently. Bianca thought she had won, she thought she had reminded me of my place, but what she had really done was cross the last line that still held me back. Dante leaned toward me, his voice low and steady. "Are you all right?" I nodded slowly. "Yes, I am more than all right." He studied my face as if searching for cracks, but all he found was calm, a dangerous calm, the kind that comes after grief has burned itself out and left only resolve around us. The guests were starting to relax again, the tension they had sensed fading as they assumed the drama was over. That assumption would cost them dearly. Preston swaggered back toward the head table, laughing loudly, slapping backs, acting like a man had just delivered a brilliant punchline. Bianca followed him, her chin high, satisfied with herself. My parents returned to their roles, smiling, chatting, pretending everything was perfect. Mama Joyce avoided my gaze completely, while Daddy Ray accepted compliments on his speech, basking in attention like a man drunk on applause. I watched them all quietly, memorizing every face, every laugh, every lie, because I knew this was the last time I would ever sit silently through their cruelty. Dante reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, pulled out his phone, and typed something quickly, his thumb moving with precision. Then he set it face down on the table and looked at me again. "Zara, what happens next is entirely up to you," he said softly. "I can step in at any moment, but if you want to do this your way, I will follow your lead." I appreciated that more than he could know. He was giving me control, something my family had spent my entire life trying to strip away. I took a slow breath, then nodded. "Just watch," I said. "The check is coming, and it is going to be spectacular." As if summoned by those words, the atmosphere in the room began to change again subtly. At first, waiters started whispering to one another near the kitchen doors, their movements no longer smooth but frantic. One of the senior catering managers hurried past the ballroom entrance, her face tight, her headset pressed to her ear. I noticed Mama Joyce glance toward the kitchen, her smile faltering just slightly. Daddy Ray followed her gaze, confusion creeping across his face. The first sign of trouble came when the bar ran out of champagne. A guest waved his empty flute, annoyed, and a bartender leaned in to whisper something. Apologetic word traveled fast in rooms like this. Within minutes, murmurs spread about missing bottles, delayed Service and unpaid balances. Preston's father stood up from his seat, his brows drawn together, his phone pressed to his ear. He paced near the head table, his confident posture beginning to collapse. Bianca noticed, too. She leaned toward him, whispering urgently, her smile now stiff and strained. Preston waved her off, laughing too loudly. "It's nothing," he slurred, "just logistics, don't worry about it." But his eyes betrayed him, darting toward the exits, then toward Dante, and finally toward me, suspicion flickering across his face like a dying bulb. Then the music stopped again, this time not by choice. The DJ leaned toward his equipment, frowning, tapping buttons, but no sound came out. The silence was thick, uncomfortable. Guests shifted in their seats, unsure of whether this was planned. Dante checked his watch calmly, then leaned toward me. "This is it," he murmured. The manager of the venue hurried onto the stage, whispering frantically to Daddy Ray, who had been coaxed back toward the microphone by the DJ. Daddy Ray's smile faltered. He tapped the mic again, his voice shaky. Folks, just a quick announcement. Seems we're having a minor technical issue with the sound system, and the catering team please remain seated. We'll have this sorted shortly." His words did nothing to calm the room. Preston's father stormed toward him, his face red. "What is going on?" He hissed loud enough for several guests to hear. "The caterers are saying payment did not clear." Daddy Ray blinked. "Payment? What are you talking about? We paid everything." Preston's father shoved his phone in his face. "The trance bounced." "Ray, the account is frozen." Bianca stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What do you mean frozen?" she demanded, her voice sharp. "This is my wedding." Daddy Ray stammered. "I don't understand. There must be a mistake." Mama Joyce rushed over her heels, clicking rapidly, her eyes wild. "I checked the account this morning. She said there was money, plenty of money." The venue manager stepped forward, clearing his throat apologetically. "I'm very sorry, but until the outstanding balance is resolved, we have been instructed to suspend service. The caterers have already begun packing up." Guests began whispering loudly. Some stood, others pulled out their phones, filming, sensing something scandalous unfolding. Preston laughed again, but it sounded brittle. "This is ridiculous," he said, trying to assert control. "I'm sure Dante can help with this, right?" "Dante, you're good for it, right? You said you were investing anyway." Dante did not stand. He did not speak immediately. He simply looked at Preston with a calm, almost bored expression, then finally said, "No, Preston, I never agreed to invest in anything. You misunderstood. I was here as a guest, nothing more." The color drained from Preston's face. "What do you mean misunderstood? You said you were interested." Dante tilted his head. "I said I was interested in conversation, not Mills or Bale. Outs, you should never confuse the two." Bianca's head snapped toward me, her eyes blazing. "This is your fault," she shrieked. "You did something. You poisoned him. You always in everything." I remained seated, my posture relaxed, my hands folded neatly on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not even stand. "Bianca," I said calmly, "you ruined this wedding long before I arrived." Preston spun toward me, pointing his finger accusingly. "You think this is funny, don't you? You broke, you jealous, which you planned this." I smiled, then a real smile, slow, controlled, and sharp. "No, Preston, I did not plan your bad credit, your maxed out accounts, or your fantasy that money grows on trees. I planned nothing, except my exit." Dante finally stood, then his presence commanding instant silence. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a slim leather portfolio, and placed it on the table beside me, opened it with deliberate care, and removed a single document. Before speaking, he held it up just enough for Preston's father to see. "This," he said, "is the deed to the Robinson family home, the one you refinanced." Without reading the fine print, Daddy Ray staggered back. "What are you talking about?" Dante continued smoothly. "The house is owned by a shell company under Sterling Holdings, which I control. The loans were structured to collapse under exactly these conditions: unpaid balances, overextension, and public default." He turned to Mom Joyce, whose face had gone white. "The money you thought you had was never yours. It was an advance. Zara approved every for every reimbursement, every payment. You took credit for her word." Landed like thunder. The room erupted into gasps, whispers, and shocked exclamations. Bianca stared at me, as if seeing me for the first time. "What is he talking about?" she whispered. Daddy Ray shook his head wildly. "This is a lie. Zara, tell them this is a lie." I finally stood, slowly smoothing my stained dress and facing the room, my heart steady, my voice clear. It is not a lie, I said quietly. I am Z. J. King, the author whose books you have all read, whose movies you will soon watch. The advances, royalties, and payments that supported my parents funded this wedding and propped up every illusion you admired. Tonight came from me. A stunned silence fell over the ballroom. Bianca let out a strangled sound like something breaking inside her. No, you're lying, she whispered. You're nothing. You're just my sister. I looked at her with pity. No, Bianca, I am everything you stood on. Preston's father turned on Daddy Ray. You let your daughter fund this entire disaster, and you didn't tell us. Daddy Ray sank into a chair. Defeated. Mama Joyce burst into tears, sobbing loudly. This is a misunderstanding, she cried. We raised her. We deserve something. Dante stepped beside me, placing a hand lightly at my back. You got exactly what you deserved, he said coldly, and nothing more. The venue manager cleared his throat again. Mr. Sterling, Miss King, until the balance is resolved, we will need to ask guests to vacate immediately. Chairs scraped back as people began leaving, some angry, some embarrassed, some whispering furiously. Phones recording every second. Bianca collapsed into a chair, her dream in ruins. Preston stared at me, hatred and disbelief twisting his face. You destroyed us, he spat. I met his gaze, unflinching. No, Preston, you destroyed yourselves. I simply stopped saving you. Dante took my hand again, this time openly, firmly. And together we walked toward the exit, through stunned guests, through whispers and flashing cameras, through the wreckage of a wedding built on lies. And as we stepped out into the cool night air, I felt lighter than I ever had before. Behind us, the music never restarted, and the celebration never resumed, and for the first time in my life, I did not look back. The night air outside was cool and carried the scent of flowers that no one had taken the time to notice earlier. I stood silently just beyond the grand arched doors of the ballroom, my dress still damp, but the fire inside me stronger than ever. Dante stood beside me, his presence a shield against chaos unraveling behind us, and for a long moment neither of us said a word. We just listened to the muffled confusion rising within the hall as reality set in for the guests inside. They were trying to make sense of it all, trying to rewrite what they had witnessed, but there was no undoing the truth that had just been laid bare. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply, and when I opened them again, the world looked sharper, clearer. The lights on the walkway sparkled, the bushes lining the stone path glistened from earlier rain, and I could hear my own heartbeat, slow and steady, like a drum of victory. Not vengeance, not hate, but release, freedom. For the first time in years, I felt untethered. Dante looked at me, his voice low and gentle. You do not have to go back in there, not now, not ever. And I knew he meant more than the ballroom. He meant the whole toxic cycle, the need for approval, the yearning for love that was never given, the exhausting chase for acceptance that only ever came with strings. I nodded, but there was something unfinished, something I needed to say one last time just to end it right. I turned back toward the door, not to re-enter, but to take a final glance through the large side window. I saw them. Bianca slumped in her chair, mascara streaked. Preston yelling at someone who no longer cared. Mama Joyce sitting stiff like a statue, as if still waiting for a camera flash. Daddy Ray rubbing his temples, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The mighty Robinson family, exposed, not ruined, not yet, but finally unmasked, and I felt no guilt, no triumph, only peace. Dante's hand slipped into mine, and without another word we walked away, not hurried, not hiding, but walking like people with nothing left to fear. The valet met us at the edge of the lot, eyes wide, unsure whether to speak, but Dante handed him a ticket, and within minutes a black car rolled up, sleek, quiet, perfect for the kind of exit I had dreamed of since I was a teenager. We got in, and as the door shut, the noise behind us faded completely. I leaned back against the seat, my eyes closed for a moment, just letting the silence settle. It was not over, not in the emotional sense, but the performance had ended. The audience had seen enough, and the curtain had fallen. Dante waited until we were driving down the avenue before speaking. That was the most honest wedding I have ever attended. I laughed, a small, real laugh, the kind that does not hurt. I do not think they will send thank you notes. He smirked. Probably not, but you gave them something they will never forget. And they gave me a gift too, I said, looking out the window. I thought being invisible was the worst thing that could happen to me, but tonight I realized it was. Blessing it kept me from becoming like them. Dante nodded. You stayed yourself, and now they cannot pretend they do not know who you are anymore. The car ride continued in quiet comfort, the city lights flashing against the tinted windows like memories trying to catch up with us, but I left them behind. Mile by mile we arrived at the hotel. Dante had reserved for himself a private suite at the top of a boutique tower with panoramic views and a calmness the wedding had never touched. He checked us in with ease, the staff discreet and respectful, as if they already knew not to ask questions. When we stepped into the suite, it felt like another world, marble floors, soft golden, lighting the scent of clean linen and quiet power. I stood at the window looking out at the skyline, glowing in the distance, and finally spoke again. Do you think she will be okay, Bianca? Dante joined me at the window, his reflection beside mine. Hard to say. She built her identity on a stage, and the curtain came down, but maybe, if she wants to become real now, she can. I thought about that long and hard, and realized I no longer cared what she did as long as I was free from it. All the rest was her journey, not mine. That night I slept deeply, no nightmares, no lingering tension, just a steady warmth, knowing that the story I had lived through was no longer being written by someone else's hand. The next morning, I woke up early, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, painting soft lines on the floor. I sat up, stretching slowly, and felt lighter than I had in years. There was a tray on the side table with fresh coffee and fruit, a note in Dante's handwriting, breakfast for the conqueror. I smiled, shaking my head, and poured myself a cup. I had not even realized how long it had been since I did something simple like this for myself. By the time Dante returned from a quick run, I was dressed and ready to leave. Where to? He asked casually. Anywhere, I said, but not home. He understood, and we spent the next few hours exploring places I had never allowed myself to visit before: art galleries, quiet parks, street vendors with stories and jokes, strangers who saw me without expectation or baggage, and for once I did not shrink or try to hide. I let myself be seen, not as Bianca's sister or the Robinsons' daughter, but just as Zara. By evening, we returned to the suite, and Dante handed me an envelope. What is this? I asked. He shrugged. Just something to consider when you are ready. Inside were 2 plain tickets, open dated, and a small brochure for a writer's retreat on the coast, a place for storytellers and survivors and dreamers. I looked at him, surprised. You planned this? He nodded. Weeks ago, before I even knew how tonight would go. I hoped you would choose yourself, and if you did, I wanted you to know the next chapter could start wherever you wanted. I was quiet for a long time, holding the envelope. Then I looked up and whispered, thank you. He reached out and gently touched my cheek. You wrote this story, Zara. You just finally let the world read it. The next few days passed like moments, an eternity. At the same time, we stayed in the city until the noise from the wedding faded from social media, until the headlines turned to something else and the whispers died down. I received calls, texts, emails, most of which I ignored. Bianca tried twice, both messages short, confused, first angry, then pleading. I deleted them. I was not cruel, but I was done with cycles that spun me into silence. Mama Joyce sent one long message filled with justifications and subtle guilt, but never once the words I was wrong or I am sorry. I did not reply. Daddy Ray tried to play the peacemaker, of course, claiming he never knew how deep the wounds went, but again, more about saving face than seeking truth. And so I let them all go, not with hate, not with drama, just silence, a clean break, the kind of silence that heals, not punishes. 1 week after the wedding, I used one of the tickets Dante gave me and flew to the coast alone. He stayed behind for work, but promised to join me later, and I believed him, not because of what he said, but because of what he had done. I arrived at the retreat just before sunset, the air salty and warm, the building nestled against a cliff like it had been carved from the rocks themselves. There were others there too, men and women of all ages, each carrying stories too heavy to keep but too precious to abandon. And in that space I found not just peace but purpose. I began writing again, not for publishers or critics but for myself, pouring years of silence into words that no longer trembled. And for the first time I felt like every sentence I wrote stitched me back together, not as someone pretending to be whole, but as someone becoming whole slowly and honestly. Dante arrived 3 days later, and when he walked through those doors, I realized something even bigger than freedom had found me, something called beginning, We sat on the porch that night watching waves crash below, and he said softly, "You are not the same woman I met at that wedding." And I smiled, because he was right. I was not. I had become the woman who no longer sat behind pillars, who no longer whispered her worth or waited for a seat at someone else's table. I had built my own, and it was beautiful. The days following the retreat melted into each other in a rhythm I had never known before, a life without constant noise or shadow expectations, without needing to second-guess every word or action or facial expression. I finally understood what it meant to just exist without performing, and I held onto that feeling like oxygen. The coastal air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine trees and ocean salt. And each morning I would sit on the porch of my little cabin, notebook in hand, coffee warm beside me, as the fog drifted across the cliffs below me. My words finally had space to breathe. Were not trying to convince or defend or explain, they simply told the truth, and with every page I filled I felt another layer of silence peel away, not just the silence others had forced on me, but the kind I had placed on myself, the internal hush of walking on eggshells too long, of waiting for someone to tell me I mattered. But those days were behind me. I was writing a new truth, one that did not begin with pain, even if it had been born from it. And in the quiet of the forest I found pieces of myself I had forgotten existed. Dante arrived again a week later, and when he stepped onto the porch and saw me with ink-stained hands and bare feet, he grinned and said, "You look like you belong here." And for the first time in my life I believed him. We spent that evening walking along the edge of the cliffs, our fingers brushing occasionally, but not needing to hold on. We talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they are comfortable in each other's presence. And that night, under a sky bursting with stars, I told him something I had never said out loud. I said, "I am not angry anymore." And he looked at me with something that felt like pride. "Then you are finally free," he said, and I knew he was right. A few days later, I received an email from one of the wedding guests, someone I barely knew but remembered vaguely from school. The subject line read, "Just wow," and the body of the message said, "I have never seen someone take back their voice like you did. It was uncomfortable and unforgettable, and I hope you never silence yourself again." That small message hit harder than I expected, because it came from someone outside the storm, someone who had no stake in the family drama, and yet had seen what was real, not the gossip, not the twisted versions that Mama Joyce was likely spreading, not the edited stories Bianca would post later with filtered smiles and carefully chosen captions. This was raw acknowledgement, and it gave me strength. Then came the article. It was not published by a major outlet, but by a regional wedding blog that had somehow picked up footage from reception. Someone had recorded the moment I stood up and walked through the crowd-soaked dress, torn dignity intact, and the caption read, "When silence is no longer an option." The video went viral, not millions, but enough that it reached people who mattered: a few editors from literary journals, a few activists who messaged with support, a few strangers who said I helped them feel brave. And while I had not done it for any of them, it still felt like justice, not in a petty sense, but in the way truth sometimes wins when you least expect it. I did not respond to the attention. I let it pass over me like waves and stayed grounded in my small cabin, in my pages, in the warmth of someone who saw me clearly. The retreat was set to end in 3 weeks, but I extended my stay by 2 months, and when the time finally came to leave, I did not feel lost. I felt ready. Dante and I returned to the city, not because we had to, but because we wanted to close that chapter on our own terms. We packed our things slowly, taking care to leave the space better than we found it. And as we drove away, I looked back once more at the cliffs and whispered, "Thank you for letting me heal." Back in the city, I started working part-time at a small bookstore, one that hosted poetry readings and open mics and community workshops. It was quiet, fulfilling, and full of people who spoke in ideas instead of judgments. I taught a few writing classes on week, and nothing official, just small groups of women who wanted to tell their stories but did not know how, and I listened as much as I guided. And in doing so, I learned that healing is not a destination, it is a practice. Then one afternoon, while I was shelving books near the front window, I saw Bianca walking by. At first, I thought I imagined it. She was thinner somehow, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and she wore oversized sunglasses. Even though the sky was gray, she walked past without seeing me. But I saw her, really saw her. and for a moment the old urge returned to turn away. But I stood my ground. She did not come, and did not look back, and I was grateful later. That night I told Dante about it, and he asked how I felt. I said I felt nothing, and that was the truth, not even sadness, just a distant neutrality, like remembering a character from a book you once read, but never quite loved. Another week passed, and I received a letter in the mail, real paper, no return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Mama Joyce. It was short, only one paragraph. It read, "Families are complicated, and we all make mistakes, but I hope you find your way back some. We are still your blood." I read it twice, then burned it, not out of anger, but because I no longer needed anything from her, not even closure. Dante stood beside me as the flames ate the paper, and when it was gone, he said, "You know what the difference is between blood and love?" And I said, "Yes, blood demands, love gives." And that was the end of that. Months passed, seasons shifted, and slowly the scars faded, not completely, but enough that they no longer dictated my days. I published my first collection of essays, titled Behind the Pillar, a reflection on silence and survival, and it was received well. Small press, modest circulation, but it reached people, and that was enough. I included one final chapter about a girl in a red dress sitting alone at a wedding, and it ended with a stranger reaching for her hand, not to save her, but to witness her. And that is what Dante had done. He witnessed me, not the version my family wanted, not the role I had been forced to play, but the real, fractured, fierce version of me. The woman who stood up, soaked and shaking, and said enough. And now, as I look back on everything that happened, I do not feel broken. I feel whole, because I faced it all. I told the story I was never supposed to tell, and I walked away not with revenge, but with truth, and that is a power no one can take. After months of staying silent, I finally decided it was time to reclaim parts of my life that had been buried beneath years of humiliation and manipulation. So I began the slow and quiet process of reclaiming what I had given up without even realizing it. I reached out to one of my old professors from university, a woman who had once told me that my voice was worth listening to, and when I sent her an email explaining what had happened and how I wanted to begin again, she replied within hours, saying she remembered me well and always believed I had more to say than I was ever allowed to. That small thread of recognition pulled something deep from within me, and I started drafting again, not just thoughts or journal entries, but actual essays, pieces of my truth, stitched together with words that I had once been afraid to speak out loud. I enrolled in an online writing course under a different name just to avoid the eyes of my family and anyone who might still be following the aftermath of the wedding scandal. I used the name May Ellis, and it felt like a small rebellion, a chance to be myself without the weight of family history and social expectations. And in that class I met people who did not care who I was before or what had happened at Bianca's wedding. They only cared about the stories I told, and whether they were honest and powerful. And every week, when I submitted a new piece and read the feedback, I felt a little braver, a little more grounded. One evening during a live workshop session, one of the instructors asked me where I pulled my emotional strength from, and without thinking, I replied, "I used to be invisible, and now I am not." And the chat lit up with messages from people saying they had felt the same, and suddenly I was not alone anymore. These were strangers, yes, but they saw me more clearly than my own blood had ever managed. And when the course ended, and they asked if I would consider leading a follow-up workshop, I cried, because for the first time in a long time, someone wanted me for my voice, not just my silence. During this time, Dante was steady and supportive, never pushing, never overstepping, just always there, his presence like a constant rhythm beside mine. He had taken up photography again, something he had stopped doing years ago, and together we would go on early morning walks, capturing the way light broke through the fog in the park, or the way the city looked half asleep and wounded at dawn, and it became our ritual. No words, just quiet companionship, a witness to each other's healing. One morning, we ended up in front of the building where Bianca worked, a coincidence really, but I froze when I recognized the sign, and he noticed immediately, asking if I wanted to leave, but I shook my head. I wanted to stay. I wanted to see it and not feel destroyed by it. and so we stood across the street sipping coffee and watching people walk in and out of the revolving doors, and I imagined her inside probably telling someone what shade of lipstick to wear for a pitch or what angle made her look more trustworthy. And for a second I did feel something, but it was not hate, it was pity, because she had everything she thought she wanted, and none of it had ever made her whole. Later that day, I received a message request on social media from an unfamiliar account, no photo, no name, just a few lines that said, "I saw what happened, I was there, and I want you to know you were never the problem." And for a moment I stared at the screen, heart pounding, because I did not know who it was, but I knew they were telling the truth, and I typed back, "Thank you, whoever you are," and left it at that. I did not need to know more. I only needed to know someone else had seen it clearly. Around that time, a podcast reached out. The host, known for telling raw and personal stories of women who had reclaimed their lives, asked if I would come on and talk about what it meant to be erased and then reborn. I was hesitant at first, not because I was ashamed, but because I did not want to give my family more ammunition. But the host promised full anonymity, voice distortion, no names, just the truth. And so I agreed. We recorded the episode in a small studio downtown, and for an hour I spoke as if I had never been silenced. I told her about the pillar, the dress, the silence, the look on my mother's face when I stood up and walked through that crowd. And I told her about the stranger who held my hand and did not let go, and about what it meant to finally have someone see you and believe you. And when it aired 2 weeks later under the title "The Girl Behind the Pillar," it became one of the most shared episodes of the year. People sent messages saying they cried in traffic or pulled over just to breathe. People said they saw themselves in my story and that they had never thought they would. And though no one in my family reached out, I knew they heard it. I knew they had to. The silence from them was louder than any words could have been. It was their final refusal to face the truth, and that silence no longer had power over me. I started getting invitations to speak at workshops and events, always under the name May Ellis, and I kept it that way because that name had become a symbol not of hiding, but of choosing, of saying, "This is mine, and no one gets to take it from me again." The more I spoke, the more I wrote, the lighter I felt, not because the pain disappeared, but because it no longer dictated the shape of my days. And people started calling me brave, but I did not feel brave. I just felt done with pretending, done with shrinking, done with waiting for someone else to give me permission to exist. It was during one of those workshops that I met an older woman who approached me after the session, eyes wet and voice shaking. She said, "Your story is not mine, but I know the silence you speak of, and I have never heard anyone give it such shape, and that one moment mattered more than any applause, because it meant the story had become more than mine. It had become a mirror for others, and that is what stories are supposed to do." Around this time I started journaling less and living more. I began making plans for a small collection of essays, maybe a book, maybe not. It did not matter what came of it, only that I continued, and Dante encouraged me every step of the way. One evening he handed me a small box. Inside was a charm bracelet with a tiny silver pillar on it. He said, "So you always remember how far you have come." And I wore it every day, not because of the wedding or the pain, but because it reminded me of that moment when I stood up and walked out on my own terms. The story was not about revenge, it never had been. It was about release, about choosing myself when no one else would. And as I moved forward, building a life that felt like mine, I carried that moment like a flame, not to burn anyone, but to light my way home. Even as the months passed and the dust of that unforgettable wedding settled, the wound inside me did not close as easily as people thought it should, because healing was not linear, and forgiveness was not something I owed to anyone, especially to those who had never once apologized. I had stopped expecting my sister to reach out or my parents to realize the weight of what they had done, because holding my breath for their redemption only left me breathless and bitter. And I was done suffocating on their silence. Instead, I poured my truth into my writing, into every line. I typed under the name May Ellis, and each word felt like reclaiming ground that had been taken from me inch by inch, and slowly the memories stopped burning and started becoming bricks in the foundation of the person I was building anew. But still there were nights when the past came clawing back, moments when a familiar scent or song would pull me into the shadows of that banquet hall, the echo of clinking glasses, the sharp smell of roses and perfume and shame. One particular evening, I was invited to speak at a conference that focused on reclaiming identity through storytelling, and though I was honored the moment I saw the list of attendees, my breath hitched. Bianca's name was not there, but one of her closest colleagues, the woman who had once told me I was too sensitive to be taken seriously, was on the panel. I debated canceling, but Dante reminded me that my presence was not a reaction to anyone else's absence or attendance. It was my own declaration of value and truth. And so I went. I walked into that venue wearing a simple black dress, hair pulled back and chin high. And though my heart thudded like a warning drum, I kept moving forward. The session went better than I expected. The audience listened without judgment, and after I finished, a line formed of people who just wanted to say thank you, and among them was the colleague. The woman who had once belittled me now stood quietly waiting for her turn. When it came, she extended her hand and said, "I owe you an apology." I did not understand back then, but I did now, and I accepted her apology, not for her but for me, because it marked a shift, a turning point that showed me I had finally broken free from the shell they once forced me to live in. Not long after that I received a letter in the mail, handwritten and sealed with no return address. The handwriting was familiar, almost painfully so, and as I opened it, my fingers trembled. The letter was from my aunt, a woman who had been like a second mother to me until the wedding shattered everything. She wrote that she had been ashamed to face me, not because she had participated, but because she had watched it all and said nothing, and her silence haunted her more than any words could. And she wrote that not a day had passed when she did not think about that moment when I was left alone behind a pillar while the world danced around me. And she ended the letter with, "I failed you, and I am sorry," and I forgive her, not because it fixed everything, but because it was real, it was raw, and it was a kind of truth that was rare in my family. I sent her a response thanking her and telling her that I was okay, not healed, not perfect, but okay. And sometimes that was enough. I had moved to a new apartment by then, with large windows and soft light, a place that felt like mine in every corner, and Dante had started leaving small notes around the space, little reminders of joy and strength. Sometimes it was a quote, other times just the words, "I see you," and those notes became anchors on the days when the tide of memory pulled too strong. My therapist once told me that trauma does not disappear, it just gets quieter with time, like a distant radio in another room. And I clung to that image because some days the volume spiked and I had to remind myself that I was not back there, not behind the pillar, not drowning in silence anymore. It was around this time that I was invited to write a foreword for an anthology of essays by women who had been through betrayal and found their voices again. And I wrote mine like a letter to my past self, to the girl in the dusty blue dress who sat alone and tried to become invisible. And I told her that she would one day rise, and not just rise but roar, and that her silence would one day become someone else's salvation. The book launched to quiet acclaim, but it did not matter, because for me it was never about fame. It was about finally using the voice that had once been ignored, and the feedback was overwhelming. Women from around the world wrote in to say they finally understood their own story through mine. And one of them, a woman from Italy, wrote, "You gave shape to my silence," and that line stayed with me, etched into my journal like a promise. One rainy afternoon, while browsing a bookstore, I stumbled upon Bianca's face on the cover of a glossy magazine. She had been interviewed about her brand, and the feature was titled "Power Through Perfection," and I stood there staring at it, heart thumping, not with anger but with sadness, because she had built a kingdom of curated moments and flawless masks, but none of it could hide the rot underneath. And I walked away, leaving the magazine untouched, because I no longer needed to read her version of the truth. I had my own. I received a message shortly after from someone I did not recognize, a woman who had once worked with Bianca and had been at the wedding, and she wrote, "I thought you were the strongest person in the room that day, even when you were sitting alone, and I wish I had told you then." And I cried reading it, because those were the moments that mattered, not public validation, but quiet truth from people who had once watched and now saw clearly. I began mentoring young writers after that, helping them shape their voices and tell their stories without fear. And I always told them the same thing: your truth is enough, and no one gets to erase you. And in their eyes I saw reflections of who I once was. Scared silence but aching to speak, and it gave me purpose more than anything else I had done. It made me feel like everything I had endured had not been for nothing. I began planning a retreat for women like me, survivors of emotional exile, women who had been erased by those closest to them, and I called it the Pillar Project, a space for healing and storytelling and being seen. And we held the first one in a small cabin near the woods, just 10 women, a fireplace, and endless cups of tea. And in that space I watched walls come down, I watched women speak their names without flinching, and when it was my turn I told them the story not just of the wedding but of everything after, of how I had to rebuild brick by brick, and how healing is not beautiful but it is real. And when I finished they stood and they hugged me, not as a speaker but as one of them, and in that moment I felt something shift. Like I had finally come full circle, like the girl behind the pillar had finally walked into the light, and this time the world did not look away. The retreat ended, but its warmth lingered like the scent of burning firewood on a sweater, and as I stepped back into my daily life, I felt a calm I had never known before. I no longer needed to explain myself to anyone, and the silence from my family that used to echo like a void now felt like distance. I had chosen a boundary, not a punishment, and with each day I became more sure of the space I had created between me and the people who once made me feel invisible. There were still occasional messages from my parents, brief dry texts with no emotion, like "Hope you are well," or "We saw your article, good job," and I would respond politely but never warmly, because there were still no apologies, no recognition of what they had allowed to happen. And I had learned not to expect healing from people who refused to admit they had wounded me. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, sipping tea, Dante walked in holding a small box with a ribbon. It was not a holiday or birthday, and I looked at him with raised brows, and he smiled and said no reason, just because, and inside the box was a necklace, a delicate silver chain with a small charm shaped like a hand holding another hand. I stared at it for a long time because it reminded me of that exact moment when everything had shifted, when I had been alone, and then not alone, when a stranger reached for me not knowing they were saving a life. And Dante said I had this made because that moment matters, and I wear it almost every day now, not because I live in the past but because I carry its lessons with me close to my heart. In late spring, I was asked to give a guest lecture at a university not far from where Bianca lived. I hesitated at first, but then I thought, why should I let proximity to pain stop me from standing in my power? I delivered the lecture to a room full of students, eager and open, and after the session, one of the faculty members introduced themselves and said, "Your sister used to study here," and my smile did not falter. But inside I thought how strange it was that Bianca and I had walked such different paths from the same starting point, and yet I no longer felt the sting of comparison, because I was not trying to outshine her or prove anything anymore. I was simply living, and that was enough. A few weeks later, I received an email with the subject line "wedding photo," and for a second my stomach flipped because the word wedding still carried weight. But when I opened it, the message was from a former photographer's assistant, someone who had worked the day Bianca got married, and he wrote, "I came across this photo while archiving old files and thought you might want it." And when I opened the attachment, it took my breath away. It was a shot of me sitting behind the pillar, but the angle was different. It showed more than just isolation. It showed resilience. My posture was tense, but my eyes held something steady, and I realized that even in my worst moment there had been strength in me. I never acknowledged. I printed the photo and placed it in a frame, not as a symbol of pain, but as proof of survival. One afternoon, while attending a local poetry reading, a woman stepped up to the mic and began reciting a piece that mirrored my story so closely I felt like the breath had been knocked out of me. And after she finished, I found her near the coffee table and asked if she had ever been to the Pillar retreat, and her eyes welled up, and she said, "I was there last fall, and your words helped me write that." And I hugged her tight, because it was moments like this that reminded me why I shared what I shared, not for fame, not for claps, but for connection, for community, and for breaking cycles. Later that month, I was approached by a journalist who wanted to write a piece on silent family estrangement, not the dramatic fallout, but the quiet, cold disconnections, the ones people don't talk about And after several emails, I agreed to share my story anonymously under a pseudonym. And when the piece was published, it went viral. People resonated with the idea of being erased without words. And I received messages from all over the world, some saying thank you, others sharing their own silent grief. And I read every single one not because I needed validation, but because it reminded me that we are never truly alone in our pain. We just think we are. One morning, I opened my inbox to find a message from someone I never thought I would hear from again. The wedding planner from Bianca's wedding. She wrote, I owe you an apology. I saw what happened. I knew it was wrong, but I stayed quiet because your sister was my client, and I prioritized my business over my conscience, and I am sorry. And I sat with that email for a while, not because I needed her apology, but because it was another thread unravel. From that tightly wound knot of that day, and every thread made it easier to breathe, I replied with a short message saying thank you, and I hope you never ignore that voice again, because it is never too late to do the right thing. And after that I let it go. One evening, I found myself revisiting the park where I had sat with the stranger the first time we met again after the wedding. The bench was still there, slightly worn but sturdy, and I sat there alone, letting the breeze carry away the last pieces of what once haunted me. And in my lap was a small notebook where I wrote a new piece, not about pain but about power, about rising from shadows and choosing light. And as the sun dipped below the trees, I felt an unfamiliar peace wash over me, not because everything was fixed, but because I had stopped waiting for things to be perfect. I had started living fully in the now. One day, as I walked past a bookstore window, I saw the anthology I had contributed to featured in a summer reading spotlight. And I paused for a moment, letting the pride settle, not flashy or loud but steady. And then I walked in, bought a copy, and donated it to the local shelter, because sometimes stories reach who they are meant to, even when we do not know how or when. Later that week, I received an invitation in the mail. Bianca was launching a new product line, and the event was invite only, but somehow my name had made it on the list. And for a moment I was torn between curiosity and caution, and in the end I chose not to go, not out of fear but out of self-respect. I no longer needed to show up in rooms that once made me feel small. I had outgrown them, and that was a victory in itself. Instead, I spent the evening with Dante, cooking dinner, dancing in the kitchen, laughing until our sides hurt, and in that moment I realized this was my joy, my family, my choice, and no one could take that away from me. I started planning the second pillar retreat, expanding it to include creative workshops, art therapy, and a panel on navigating family dynamics, and the applications poured in more than I had space for. And I knew this was bigger than me. It had become a movement, and as I sat reading the applications late into the night, I saw story after story of women who had been dismissed, overlooked, silenced, and now they wanted to speak. And I knew then that I had not just healed, I had built something from the ashes, and it would continue to grow. As the summer faded into a cooler breeze and the golden leaves began to fall, I found myself reflecting more and more on the life I had rebuilt, and how far I had come from the woman who sat behind a pillar on her sister's wedding day. I was no longer the girl who waited for someone to save her. I had become the woman who had reached for her own hand, pulled herself out, and found strength she never imagined existed. It was not about forgetting what had happened, but about transforming it, turning the silence and shame into purpose and pride. And just when I thought the waves had calmed, another ripple came uninvited. It was a call from my mother, a voice I had not heard in over a year, since before the retreat, since before the silence became a wall between us. Her tone was hesitant, almost rehearsed, and she said, "Your father is in the hospital, and they do not know what it is yet, but he asked about you." And my hands went cold, because despite everything, despite the betrayal and the years of being unseen, this was still my father. I asked which hospital, what room, and what time, and she told me. And before I could stop myself, I said, "I will be there." And when I hung up the phone, I sat there for a long time, just breathing, remembering the last time I saw him at the wedding, standing beside Bianca, all smiles, like nothing was wrong, as if I had not been shoved behind a pillar like clutter they did not want in the picture. And yet here I was on my way to him now, not because I owed it, but because closure sometimes comes in forms we do not expect. When I walked into the hospital room, I barely recognized him. He had aged in ways time alone could not explain. There was fragility in his frame, a looseness in his grip on the present, and when he saw me, his eyes filled with something I could not place. Regret, guilt, love, maybe all of it. He reached out his hand and I took it, because that is what you do when you are healing, not for them, but for you. He whispered, I thought you hated me, and I said I did for a while, and then I just let go. He nodded slowly and said I should have said something that day, and I replied, yes, you should have, and that was it. No dramatic hugs, no forgiveness wrapped in a bow, just truth placed gently between us like a folded letter. And when I left the room, I did not look back, not out of spite, but because I had already gotten what I came for, a moment of honesty and the chance to walk away standing tall, not slumped by grief or confusion. Days passed, and then weeks, and though my father's condition stabilized, our connection did not grow, because one moment of truth does not erase a lifetime of silence, and that was okay. I had made peace with not having the father I wished for, and instead cherishing the woman I had become without him. Bianca reached out 2 weeks later, a text that read, I heard you visited Dad, thank you, and I stared at that message for 10 minutes, unsure what to do, and then I typed you are welcome and hit send, and that was all I had to give. She tried again a few days later with a longer message saying she had been going to therapy, had learned things about herself, and that she hoped one day we could talk, and I appreciated that. I really did, but I also knew my healing was not dependent on her growth. I responded, I am glad you are doing the work, and left it there, because sometimes boundaries are the real bridges. They keep us from drowning in other people's currents. As the days grew shorter, I poured my energy into the second retreat. It was shaping up to be even more powerful than the first. We had writers, artists, survivors, advocates, and healers, and each woman brought a story that echoed a part of mine yet stood entirely her own, and I saw them begin to shed the shame, to stretch into their truths. And one night during a group sharing circle, someone said, your story saved me, and I cried, not because I felt pride, but because I felt purpose. My pain had not been for nothing, and that is a feeling worth everything. Dante continued to be my constant, the gentle voice when the past whispered too loud, the hand on my back when I stepped into new rooms scared but determined. He never tried to fix me, just walked beside me, and that made all the difference. One evening he surprised me with a small dinner on our balcony, lights strung above us, soft music in the background, and he handed me a letter, no envelope, just a folded page. And in it he wrote about the first time he saw me, how he almost did not walk over, how something in his chest told him to go, and how grateful he was that he listened. He wrote about love not as a rescue, but as a reflection, and he ended the letter with, if you ever want to build forever together, I am ready. And I looked up, tears in my eyes, and said yes, not because I needed saving, but because I had saved myself, and now I was ready to build, not from pieces, but from strength. We decided on a small ceremony, nothing fancy, just real and raw, surrounded by the few people who had walked with us through our darkest hours. No red bows, no perfect photos, just truth and connection and joy. I invited my mother. She came quiet and unsure, but present. She cried during the vows, not loudly, but enough. And after the ceremony she approached me and said, you look happy, and I replied, I am. And we hugged briefly, not tightly, but real. And in that moment I felt something shift, not reconciliation, but recognition, and that was enough. The rest of evening was laughter, dancing barefoot under the stars, music that wrapped around our hearts like a warm scarf. And I looked at Dante and thought, this is what love is, not grand gestures or forced forgiveness, but showing up, choosing again and again to be kind, to be true, and to be free. And as we cleaned up the space, someone handed me a forgotten gift bag at the bottom of the table, and inside was a framed quote that reads, sometimes the family you need is the one you create. And I smiled, because yes, this was the family I chose, not bound by blood, but by love and truth. And in that moment, everything made sense. The first time I walked into the community center alone, without Bianca, without my parents, without any familiar face watching me, I felt the kind of silence that trembles beneath the skin, but I did not let it stop me. I had agreed to speak for the first time, not just share my story in writing or in whispers behind closed doors, but to stand in front of an audience and tell it out loud, my voice quivering perhaps, but no longer hidden. And the night before I could not sleep. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, thinking about every moment that brought me here, every rejection, every cold shoulder, every tear swallowed at dinner tables where I was never asked how I felt. And now here I was ready to speak, not for them, but for me, for the girl behind the pillar, for the woman who held her own hand. And the room was fuller than I expected, faces I did not recognize, and a few I did. The retreat organizer had done an amazing job inviting people from all walks of life, survivors, supporters, strangers, and I stood backstage with a mic in my hand, heart thudding in my chest as the MC introduced me, her words glowing with praise I barely heard because all I could hear was my own breath. And then the light hit me soft and warm, and I stepped out into the glow, not knowing what would happen next. I started slowly, my name, my story, and then the memories poured out, not as pain but as truth, like a stream that had long been dammed, finally let free. I told them about the wedding, about the pillar, about laughter that echoed while I sat alone, about the man who reached for my hand and reminded me I was human. And as I spoke, the room grew still. People listened, eyes wide, hearts open. And when I reached the moment, I stood up and walked away from my family. A hush fell, and I saw tears in some eyes nod from others, and something in me began to heal in real time, not because they pitied me, but because they understood. I ended my story with a message that had become my truth. You do not need their permission to take up space. And when I stepped off the stage, the applause felt like thunder, and I felt taller than I ever had in my life. People came up to me afterward, hugging me, thanking me. And one young woman said I thought I was the only one, and I told her you are not, and we cried together, strangers bound by truth. And in that moment I realized something: my story was never just mine, it was mirror for others, and that made every moment behind that pillar worth it. Dante was there too, standing at the back, arms crossed, smile quiet but proud, and when I found him in the crowd, he said, I knew you could, and I said, I know, and we walked home hand in hand through streets that felt softer now, lighter, and I knew that something had shifted forever. In the weeks that followed, my speech traveled. It was shared online, clipped, quoted, and one day I got an email from a university asking if I would come speak at a seminar on resilience and healing, and I stared at the screen for a long time before I said yes, because it was never about becoming famous or loud. It was about never being invisible again. I prepared for the seminar like it was a mission, writing, refining, practicing in front of the mirror. And when the day came, I wore the same bracelet I had on at the wedding, a small reminder of girl I used to be, and I stepped onto that campus with my head high. The auditorium was packed, and as I began speaking, I felt calm, not nervous, because I knew now that every word had power, and I was ready to use mine. When I finished, a professor approached me and said, your story will be part of our curriculum next semester, and I blinked, stunned, and then smiled, because it meant other girls like me would hear it, would know they are not alone, and that matters more than applause, more than recognition. It means impact, and that is what I had been chasing, not revenge, not attention, just change in small waves. And then came the letter from Bianca, a real letter, not a message, not a text, handwritten, pages filled with words I never thought I would hear. She wrote about guilt, about confusion, about realizing the depth of what she had done. She said, I thought I was protecting my image, but I was destroying our bond. And she said, I know sorry is not enough, but I want to start from there. And I read it 3 times, heart aching. And then I folded it quietly and placed it in a drawer, not out of anger, but because I was not ready, and that was okay. Healing is not linear. It bends, folds, pauses, and I would respond when I was ready, if I was ready. Dante never pushed, just listened, held space, and loved me in silence and presence. And one night, as we lay under the stars, he asked, do you think you will ever speak to her again? And I said, maybe, but not today. And he nodded and kissed my forehead, and we watched the sky like it was speaking to us in light and stillness. And in that stillness I felt whole, not because everything was perfect, but because I was no longer hiding. The next time I spoke at an event, I brought a woman from the retreat with me. She had found her voice in my story, and now she wanted to share hers, and watching her stand on that stage, tremble, cry, and then smile, I felt proud like a mother watching her child bloom. And I knew this was my path, not just telling my story, but opening doors for others to tell theirs. And when she came down from the stage, she hugged me and said, "I never thought I would feel brave again, and I whispered you already where you just forgot." And I kept building from there, little by little, moment by moment, retreat by retreat, talk by talk. I was rebuilding not just myself, but a community of truth speakers, people who had been silenced, ignored, pushed aside, and now were rising. And every time I saw one of them take that first step, speak that first word, I felt the past losing its grip. And that is what freedom feels like, not forgetting, but remembering differently. And one morning, as I made coffee, sun streaming in, Dante said, "You should write a book." And I laughed, but the idea stayed with me, and weeks later, I began writing not just about the wedding, but everything before and after, about love, shame, silence, strength. And by the time I finished the first draft, I knew it was not just a book. It was a map for anyone who had ever felt invisible. And when the publisher said yes, I cried, because it meant the story would travel even further, reach even more hands. And when the release date came, Bianca sent flowers, no note, just the bouquet, and I smiled, not because we were fixed, but because we were trying in our own quiet ways, and that is enough. Sometimes it has to be. The weeks that followed were quiet in a strange way, not the kind of silence that feels lonely, but the kind that lets you breathe. And for the first time in a long time, I found myself waking up without that ache in my chest, the ache of trying to be seen, trying to be heard, trying to earn a place in my own family. And one afternoon, while I was cleaning up my desk, I found a crumpled envelope at the bottom of a drawer. It was one I had pushed aside weeks earlier without opening, because the handwriting on the front was familiar, and I was not ready then, but something about that day made me pause. I sat down and carefully unfolded the pages, and it was a letter from my mother. It was not long, but each line felt like a crack in a wall I had believed would never move. She wrote about the wedding, about how she had seen me sitting behind that pillar, about how she noticed the look on my face and felt something twist inside her, but did not know what to do. And she said she was sorry, not just for that day, but for all the moments before when she had stayed silent when she should have spoken. And as I read her words, I realized something. I had spent years waiting for an apology from them, but when it came, it did not feel like a victory. It felt like a doorway, and the question now was, did I want to step through? I sat with that for days, carrying the letter in my bag, rereading it at random times, unsure what it meant for the future. And then one night, Dante and I were sitting on the balcony, the city humming below us, and he said something that stayed with me. Forgiveness is not a gift for them. It is something you give yourself when you are ready. And I looked at him and said, "What if I never am?" And he just shrugged and said, "Then that is okay too." And I loved him more in that moment than I ever had, because he never pushed, never told me what I should feel. He just made space for whatever I did. And later that week, Bianca called me again, and this time I picked up. Her voice was soft, cautious, and for the first few seconds we did not say anything. And then she asked if we could meet, and I said maybe. And I heard her breath catch, and she said, "I miss you," and I said, "I know," and we left it at that. Days passed before I called her back, and when I did, we agreed on a public place, somewhere open and neutral. We met at a small cafe I used to visit with her in high school, and when I saw her sitting there, it was like time folded and unfolded at once. She stood when I approached, and for a second we just stared at each other. Then she reached out slowly, like she was touching glass, and I let her hug me. It was stiff, awkward, not like before, but it was real, and that was enough. For now we sat and talked, not about the wedding, not yet, but about everything else, work, childhood, random memories. And after a while I saw something flicker in her expression, like she was trying not to cry, and she finally said, "I messed up, I know." And I said, "Yes, you did," and she nodded like she had been waiting to hear that. And then I said, "But I am still here, and so are you, so maybe that means something." And we both exhaled at the same time, and something fragile and unspoken settled between us. We did not solve everything that day, but we started, and that matters. And in the months that followed, we kept meeting, small steps, careful words, learning each other all over again. And sometimes we stumbled, sometimes I left her messages unanswered, and she gave me space. Sometimes she said the wrong thing and I pulled back, but we kept trying, and it was not about being sisters again. It was about being two women who had survived something and were figuring out how to live after it. One evening, she invited me to dinner at our parents' house, and my first instinct was to say no, but I paused and asked would they even want me there. And she said they asked me to invite you, and I told her I would think about it, and I did for 3 whole weeks before saying yes. And when the day came, I stood outside their house, heart pounding like a drum, and Dante squeezed my hand and said, "You do not have to go in." And I said, "I know, but I want to." And I stepped inside. The house smelled the same, the hallway looked the same, but everything felt different. And my mother was in the kitchen, and when she saw me she smiled, not wide but enough. And my father was quiet as always, but he nodded at me, and that was the most I could expect from him. And during dinner there were pauses, long silences, but also laughter and questions and attempts. And when I left the night I realized something. They were never going to become the parents I needed, but they were trying to meet me where I was now, and that is all I could ask for Bianca. And I walked out together, and she said thank you for coming, and I said thank you for asking, and that night I slept better than I had in months, because even if nothing else changed, I had changed, and that made all the difference. Later that summer, I was invited to a panel about sibling relationships and trauma, and I almost turned it down, but then I thought maybe someone out there needs to hear this, and I accepted. And when I stood on that stage, I told them about love that forgets, about shame that hides, about forgiveness that grows slow like roots in dry ground. And afterward, a woman came up to me with tears in her eyes and said, "You just told my story." And I told her, "No, I told mine, and yours just found a way in." And that is the beauty of truth. It echoes in others, and sometimes those echoes become bridges. And a few weeks after the panel, I received a message from the retreat coordinator. She said, "We are planning another session, and we want you back, not just as a speaker, but as a mentor." And I agreed without hesitation, because that place changed me, and now I wanted to help it change others. And when I returned, it felt like coming home, and the new faces, their wide-eyed nervous, reminded me of my first time. And I stood before them not as a survivor, but as a guide, and I told them, "You are not broken, you are not invisible. Your story matters." And they listened and nodded, and I could see the spark of belief beginning to flicker, and I knew in that moment that everything I had endured was not for nothing. It had brought me here, to this room, to these people. And that is what healing is: not a straight line, not a single breakthrough, but a collection of moments when you choose to keep going, when you choose to speak, when you choose to love again, even if it is hard. And later that evening, as the group sat around a fire, one of the new girls asked me, "What would you tell your younger self?" And I said I would tell her, "You are allowed to leave the table if love is no longer being served." And everyone went quiet, and I saw heads nodding, and in the silence that followed, I felt peace, not loud or showy, just quiet, steady peace, like a hand resting on your shoulder, reminding you that you made it, and you are still making it, one day at a time. The morning after the wedding, I woke up with a dull ache in my chest, like someone had left a weight on me while I slept, and no matter how many deep breaths I took, the heaviness did not lift. I did not even bother to brush my hair or change my clothes. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the wall, wondering if what happened the day before had really happened, or if I had imagined the whole thing. But the faint scent of roses and perfume lingering on the borrowed dress draped over the back of the chair reminded me it had all been real. The words my sister threw at me, the look of disappointment on my parents' faces, the way they acted like I was a burden, a background detail, someone who should be hidden behind a pillar and forgotten, all of it was burned into me like a scar that would not heal. I checked my phone. There were no messages, no calls, not from my sister, not from my parents, not even from my cousins who had danced like fools all night and never once looked over to where I sat alone by the cold concrete column. But there was one message. It was from him, the stranger with the calm voice and kind eyes, who had taken my hand the night before. His message was simple: "Good morning. I hope you got home safe, and I hope today is easier than yesterday." I stared at it, unsure what to feel. Part of me wanted to delete it and pretend nothing had changed. Another part wanted to write back immediately, to hold on to the one thing from yesterday that had felt real. I replied with just 2 words: Thank you, and I put my phone down and went to shower. The water was hot, almost too hot, but I let it sting my skin because I wanted to feel something. I wanted to scrub the night away. The silence of the house was thick. My parents had gone to a post-wedding brunch and did not invite me again. I was not surprised. I made toast and stared out the kitchen window, watching the wind push leaves across the grass. Then my phone buzzed again. It was him. He asked if I would like to take a walk with him that afternoon. Just a walk, nothing fancy, no pressure. He said he understood if I did not feel up to it. And I almost said no. I almost let myself curl back into the silence. But instead I said yes. We agreed to meet at the park near the library around 3. I changed into something simple, a long beige coat and black jeans, and I wrapped a scarf around my neck, not because it was cold, but because I needed comfort. I arrived early, the bench by the entrance still damp from the morning. I waited watching people pass by, old couples, holding hands, kids, riding bikes, a man walking a dog. Then I saw him walking toward me in a blue sweater and dark jeans, his hair slightly windblown, and a soft smile on his face. And when he reached me, he said, "I am glad you came." I said, "Me too." And we started walking the path wound through tall trees, their branches bare, and reaching the air was crisp, and every now and then a leaf would fall spiraling slowly to the ground. We did not talk much at first, just walked side by side. The silence between us was not awkward, it was peaceful. Eventually he asked how I was really, and I told him the truth. I told him how I felt invisible at my sister's wedding, how she made me sit alone, how my parents did not say a word, how the whole day made me feel like I was not part of family. And as I spoke my voice cracked, but he did not interrupt. He just listened, and when I finished, he said, "I do not think you are invisible. I think you are someone they do not understand, because you do not fit into the picture they painted. But that does not mean you are not worth seeing." We kept walking, and he told me a little about himself, about his sister, who used to push him around, until one day he stood up for himself and she cried, and then they became closer than ever. He said, "Sometimes it takes breaking something to rebuild it right." I nodded, unsure if my sister and I would ever get there. He asked what I liked to do, what made me feel alive, and I realized I had not thought about that in a long time. I said I used to love painting and reading poetry and watching old movies alone with popcorn and a blanket. He smiled and said, "That sounds perfect," and I said yeah. It was. We walked for almost an hour, then sat on a bench near the small pond watching ducks float past. He told me about a book he was reading and asked if I wanted to borrow it. I said yes, even though I was not sure I would rate it. But it felt good to be offered something with no strings attached. When we parted ways, he said, "I hope this is not the last time we talk," and I said, "Me too," again, and we exchanged numbers properly, not just on social media, but real numbers, and he promised to call in a few days. The walk did not fix everything, but it gave me a breath, a crack of light in the fog. I went home, and for the first time in weeks I opened my sketchbook and drew not much, just the trees from the park, the pond, the curve of the path. But it felt like something I could hold on to. My parents returned late that evening, laughing about something that happened at brunch, and they barely glanced at me before going to their room. I did not say anything. I did not expect anything anymore. My sister posted more pictures from the wedding, all glowing and perfect, and I scrolled through them, not with jealousy, but with distance, like I was looking at someone else's life, and maybe I was. Maybe the girl in the pictures who smiled awkwardly behind a pillar was gone, and someone new was standing in her place, someone quieter, but not weaker, someone who had been seen, even if just for a moment, by someone who did not owe her anything. The next morning, I got another message from him asking if I would like to go to a small poetry reading downtown the coming weekend, and without hesitation I said yes, and I could feel something inside me shift, not in a dramatic way, but like the slow turning of a page, like maybe my story was not over, and maybe, just maybe, I got to decide what came next. I had no idea how fast everything was about to change, but the way he looked at me that night, as if I was worth something, as if I mattered more than just the awkward girl hiding behind a pillar, it stayed with me long after the wedding lights faded and the music stopped. I never told my sister about him not because I wanted to keep him a secret, but because I knew she would never understand someone like him who saw through the silence and chose to sit beside it instead of mocking it. The days that followed were strange, slow, and full of questions. I kept wondering if it was all just a moment, a fluke, but then the calls started short at first, just checking in, asking how I felt, talking about nothing and everything. And soon those calls became the best part of my day, like sunlight coming in through a cracked door, warming a room that had been cold for far too long. His name was Mark, and he worked as a physical therapist for veterans. He told me stories of men who had lost everything but still smiled, and somehow those stories gave me strength. I remember once he said healing is not about pretending nothing happened. It is about choosing to live anyway, and I think that is what he did for me. He made me choose life even when I still felt broken. I finally started going out, not much at first, just walks around the block, small grocery trips, sitting in the park with a book. I was scared. People would stare or judge or pity, but no one did, and when they did I realized it did not matter. Because I was finally choosing myself, and that felt like power. Mark and I started meeting more often, coffee walks, museums. He showed me corners of the city I had never dared to explore, and each time I felt more like a person, less like a shadow. One day, while we were walking along the river, he reached for my hand, not like he had to, but like he wanted to, and I let him hold it tightly, not just because I liked him, but because I trusted him in a way I had never trusted anyone before. I told him everything eventually, about the accident, about the surgeries, about my sister, about how invisible I had felt sitting behind that pillar, and he listened, not with pity, but with fierce attention. And when I finished, he did not say anything for a long time, just looked at me with this calm that felt like home. And then he said, "I am glad you were there that day, because I would have never met you otherwise." It took me a long time to believe someone could really want me, not just accept me or tolerate me, but want me with my limp and my scars and my quiet way of living. But he did, and not because he was lonely or kind, but because he saw something in me I had not seen in myself in a long time, worth the effort, worth the wait. Months passed, and my confidence returned slowly, like waves coming back to the shore. I signed up for online classes, something I had put off for years, because I never felt smart enough or strong enough, and Mark helped me through the whole process. Late night study sessions, surprise coffee deliveries, even sitting with me during virtual exams just to calm my nerves. It was more than support, it was belief. And that belief changed everything. I finally stood up to my sister, too, not in anger, but in truth. I told her how I felt that day at her wedding, how being seated behind the pillow made me feel unwanted and forgotten, and she cried, not because she felt guilty, but because she realized she had hurt me more than she knew. We did not become best friends overnight, but something shifted. She started asking how I was actually listening when I answered, even invited me to dinner once. Just me and her, no crowd, no noise, just us. And in that small, quiet space, I found peace with her too. I will never be the same girl I was before the accident, and that is okay, because now I am someone else, someone I fought to become, someone who knows her worth. And it all started with that wedding, that pillar, and the hand that reached for mine when I thought I would sit alone forever. A year after that wedding, Mark proposed, nothing grand, just a quiet evening, a walk by the same river where he first held my hand, and a question asked with a smile that felt like coming home. I said yes, not because I needed saving, but because I wanted a partner, someone who had seen the worst and still stayed. Our wedding was small, only close friends and a few family members, no pillars, no hiding, just laughter and honesty and love. And when I walked down that aisle, there was no limp in my spirit, no shame in my steps. I saw my sister in the front row, tears in her eyes and pride on her face, and I knew we had both grown in our own ways. As I reached the end of that aisle, Mark took my hand again, just like he did the first time, and whispered, "I see you, I always did." And in that moment I believed him fully, truly, because now I saw myself too, not broken, not hidden, just real and ready and finally whole. This story is not just about revenge, it is about truth, pain, and rising stronger than before. If this hit your heart, then you know what to do. Like the video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more real stories that burn like fire. Until next time, stay sharp, stay loud, stay rebel.